Good morning, and today we're going to talk about A Rose for Emily's plotline, particularly the different types of suspense by William Faulkner. But first, we should probably start off with the plot analysis. Now, most good stories start with a fundamental list of ingredients. You need the initial situation, which leads to the first conflict. There's going to be complications with that conflict, and that's going to climax into the major ending of the story. There's going to be a suspense in case you're not quite sure what's going on, but then we have everything wrapping up neatly in its denouement, and then we have the conclusion of the story. Now, great writers sometimes shake up this recipe and they add some spice. So usually we see this fundamental list going in this particular order. William Faulkner does not like to follow this order. So our initial situation, when we talk about what's going on in the story, we have perhaps death and taxes being described by Benjamin Franklin. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. So the conflict that we start off with in our story are about Emily Grierson's taxes and how she doesn't want to pay them. But taxes aren't the only thing that stinks around here. Now, the taxes seem tame compared to what comes next in the story. Now, in section 2, we learn lots of bizarre stuff about Miss Emily Grierson. When her father died, she refused to believe it, or let on that she believed that her father died, for 4 days, counting the day he died. The town talks about how they practically have to force their way into the Grierson's home in order to quickly and quietly bury Mr. Grierson. Now, the summer after her father died, Emily finally gets a boyfriend for the first time. She's in her 30s, and that would have been considered very rare at the time. Now, a lot of the town folk believe that Emily hasn't had any boyfriends before this point because her father did not want to let her go. He had lost his wife at a young age, and so he's basically taken Emily on as the caretaker of the house. But the summer after her father died, she finally gets a boyfriend in her 30s. And when she's worried that her boyfriend might be done with the relationship and might leave her, she bought some poison, and her boyfriend disappeared. And when we talk about taxes not being the only thing that stinks, all of a sudden there's a very bad smell around the Grierson household. Now, you technically have enough information at this point in the story to figure everything out right here. But we're thrown off by the issue of the taxes. Why is the story about the taxes we learned about in the first part of the story unresolved? And we're also thrown off by the way in which your facts are jumbled together by your author. Now, the complication of the story is the people or person who's telling the story, and that's the town's conscience. For this stage, it might be helpful to think of the story as a town's confession. This section is what complicates things for the town's conscience. Now, the town was horrible to Emily when she started dating Homer Barron. They wanted her to hold on to the southern ideals her forbearers had mapped out for her. They felt kind of bad for poor Miss Emily that her father had never let her date any of the boys or any of the gentlemen in her younger years. So when she finally gets a man, Homer Barron, around to kind of date her and take her out onto the town, you would think they'd be pleased. But since he's from the north, and since he's not an upper class society man, he's from the working class, they didn't think he was good enough for Emily. So they wanted to start saying horrible things, not directly to her, but behind her back. Now, Emily was finally able to break free when her father died and make her own decisions. But here we see the town still doesn't let her do it. When they can't stop her from dating Homer themselves, they're actually going to send her flesh and blood, their cousins, to do so. Now, we're not 100% sure how the conversation plays out. We don't hear from Emily's point of view ever. We don't hear from the cousin's point of view. But we know when they come to visit Emily, they're sent off pretty quickly. And Homer Barron arrives later that night after they leave. Now, the climax of the story is actually towards the very beginning. Even though the story seems all jumbled up chronologically, the climax comes roughly in the middle of the story, lending the story a smooth, symmetrical feel. Now, according to Faulkner, Homer was probably a bit of a rat, one which noble Miss Emily would have felt perfectly in the right to exterminate. Yet she also wanted to hold tight to the dream that she might have a normal life with love and a family, and this is the only gentleman that she possibly could have at this point. Now, when Emily sees that everybody, the townspeople, the minister who was sent later, her cousins who were sent to talk to her, even Homer himself, everybody is bent on messing up Emily's plans, and therefore she has an extreme reaction. That's why for us the climax is encapsulated in the image of the skull and crossbones on the arsenic package that she gets from the pharmacist and the warning for rats. Now the suspense we have here again comes from the town's conscience, from the people telling the story. And as with the climax, Faulkner follows a traditional plot structure, at least in the terms of the story between Emily and Homer. You see at almost the beginning of the story in part 2, Emily buying the arsenic. And at that moment, the information is given to the townspeople, but not necessarily the reader. You don't know why she's buying the arsenic. You're just assuming that she's buying it for rats because that's what the package says. And you hear there's this terrible smell around the house, so we're making the assumption that we're using the arsenic for what the label says. Now, the town is in suspense over whether or not Emily and Homer Barron are married, or are they soon going to be married, or they never will be married. There's different parts of gossip talking about how they don't know everything that Emily's doing. She only just has the one man who works around the house for maintenance and buys her groceries. She doesn't come out amongst the people to talk to them. And so when they notice that Emily is buying men's toiletry items, they're thinking that they're married already or they soon will be. And remember, they didn't quite appreciate Homer Barron. He's from a working class society and he's from the North. So the reactions range from murderous to pitying poor Miss Emily to downright want to interfere and send in the cousins and the minister. We also learned that Homer Barron was last seen entering the residence of Miss Emily Grierson on the night in question. So we can be in suspense about what happened to him, although by the time we can appreciate that this is something to be suspenseful about, you probably already know what happens to Homer Barron. Then we get to the denouement. Now, we have the next 40 years being shown to us at the very beginning of the story and towards the very end of the story. You've already been given a rough outline of Emily's life, beginning with her funeral. She dies in the very first part of the story. And then you go back 10 years in the first part of the story when the newer generation came to collect the taxes that she refused to pay. And then you go back another 30-some odd years to the death of Emily's father. And then we continue on in the other parts of the story with the subsequent affair with Homer and the disappearance with Homer. So the story winds down by filling us in on Miss Emily's goings in the next 40 years between Homer's disappearance and her actual funeral. Other than the painting lessons, her life during that time is a mystery because she hermits herself inside her house. She does not leave. So in case you didn't get the ending of the story from all of the clues, there is a conclusion to the story. The townspeople are going to enter the room that's been locked for 40 years, and they hint that they kind of already know what's there. They find the rotting corpse of Homer Barron in the bed. Well, that's what we are going to say about The Rose for Emily. If you want to see a very quick timeline of Rose for Emily, please go back and check out my other videos online. If you're also looking for more William Faulkner stories, leave a comment down below. Let me know what other parts of William Faulkner you'd love for me to go through. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed.